and welcome to the first episode of the Mistwalkers podcast. My name is Chris. I'm a communications student and a dungeon master who's currently running the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons module, Curse of Strahd. I am joined by one of my players who I'll introduce in a moment, but first I wanted to discuss what this podcast is about. As a student of media studies, I am fascinated by storytelling and how different genres and different mediums tell stories in different ways. D&D and other tabletop role-playing games are, of course, a form of storytelling, but they are unique in terms of how its audience, the players, interact with it. The DM is the author, but the players act as both audience and secondary author, and this leads it to being a truly singular medium. What we want to do in this podcast is break down D&D as a storytelling medium through the lens of the 5th edition module Curse of Strahd, as we go over the storytelling and role-playing decisions that we've made and what we felt they've added to the story in the game. There will be some synopsizing, but we're less interested in discussing what happened and more interested in discussing why it happened. Now, with that out of the way, my little thesis statement, or preamble if you will, I would like to introduce my co-host, Josh. How you doing tonight, Josh?
I'm doing good. Obviously, my name is Josh, and I actually had graduated with a degree in communication arts. So analyzing and producing media was very much my intended profession before I found myself instead just becoming a civil servant. That said, back in middle school, I did host a podcast about the game Tabula Rasa, named Behind the Front Lines, and then around high school took on the name Richten for the Free Play podcast, where my friend and I had reviewed free-to-play online games, and then had a brief podcasting experience as the junior co-host for the Multiverse podcast. For some strange reason, I felt oddly content to say my broadcasting career peaked at age 16. But after, we started playing D&D, and then you took on, as became the new DM, I don't know, it was just such a compelling experience that when you suggested starting a podcast for Curse of Strahd, I could not help but, come out of retirement.
You have a little bit of experience, a lot of experience. Like, that's what, 3 podcasts you did all the way back in middle school and high school? But, you say you peaked back then, but I think that's just it was like kind of the foothills leading up to hopefully an upcoming mountain of great Dungeons and Dragons content.
Yeah, indeed, the prepubescent and pubescent podcasting careers were just leading us to this particular moment, I'm sure.
Interesting choice of words. So, as I said, I'm the Dungeon Master for my Curse of Strahd group. We are running the highly acclaimed 5th edition module Curse of Strahd, and I just want to say, before we get into this, that this podcast will contain spoilers for Curse of Strahd. If we are still pretty early on, but if you are in a Curse of Strahd campaign, I just ask that you please respect your DM and either please tune out, or if you are still interested in watching this, please talk to your DM and just clear it with them first, because you don't want to spoil yourself on anything exciting that may be coming up, because there are quite a number of exciting things coming up on our campaign, and I wouldn't want it ruined for my players, and I'm sure your DM would not want it to be ruined for his or hers.
Also, if you're part of our campaign, just stop. Just stop. Don't. Just pause now and just close it out. Please.
Absolutely. One thing I also want to mention is that while we are running the 5th edition module from the book itself, I have homebrewed in a number of story elements. So the story that we were playing through is not completely ripped right from the campaign. There are changes, there are additions, there are alterations, there are subtractions. Some of these things are things that I completely made myself. These are complete original story ideas, but some of these are also things that I took from the internet, inspiration from YouTube channels and reading places online, and even a couple YouTube comments. There's one notable story which we haven't gotten to yet, so you don't have to worry about that, Josh. But I just saw it on a YouTube comment, and I was like, wow, that's a cool idea. I'm adding it to my campaign.
It is almost certainly not to my benefit, but thanks for the heads up.
You're welcome. One thing I want to say is that we are a few sessions in. We had a session 0, and we had session 1 and session 2, so there's a little bit of catching up to do. Josh, I believe you wanted to kind of give a brief synopsis of the story thus far.
Yeah, so won't do a full beat by beat, but kind of just a summary of the sessions so far, I suppose. We did have a kind of introduction of everyone's party inside a tavern. Um, Met all of the characters and the very suspicious plot-driving NPC Aragal, who was going to lead us to face some werewolves before disappearing and then letting us just utterly disappear into mists, more kind of like being like consumed by the mists, before we found ourselves in this very other type space. It is ambiguous whether or not we're still in the Forgotten Realms. Think it's not too crazy to say it's probably not. Um, but yeah, we find ourselves then kind of on this just mist, kind of mist valleyed or mist, not quite mist horned, just surrounded by mist and unable to go anywhere but one direction on a road.
Yeah, one of our party members tried to walk into the mist and say, "Oh well, we'll just leave the way we came," and they got spat right back out, and they got a level of exhaustion. It was not a good time.
Yeah, that was something. Saw that coming, or at least going poorly. And then found ourselves met by some children on the road outside a home, asking for help from a monster. Very much a kind of "it's a trap" kind of vibes. But we ended up going inside the home, finding ourselves locked inside of it, going through out of it, and I think we'll do a few of the greater beats of being in that house at a slightly later point. But ultimately, upon leaving the house, found ourselves actually entering the village of Barovia and finally getting to meet some of what seemed to be some more story heavy NPCs, and finally some people that weren't trying to kill us.
Session 3 started, we were still inside the house. In the there's the main house, and then there's the basement and a sub basement. And the party, through spending a little bit of time there, quickly learned that this house is haunted, possessed. It has the spirits of some ancient cultists that were sacrificing people to some malevolent being. What kind of being this is? It's a little vague, but the campaign guide, the family that owned this house is referred to as the Dursts. I renamed them the Harkers as a little nod to the best character in Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mina Harker. No one caught on to that reference, but that was fine. I wasn't disappointed, not at all.
Yeah, if you were hoping for a moment of like remorse from this, it yeah completely lost on me and had very few feelings when you told me.
Y'all need to read more
Thumbs up.
classic literature.
Mm. So Chris, to that end, actually, I want to pause you because I know you mentioned in aside in some of our private conversations that you were a little frustrated how much we failed to question the suspicious behavior of meeting Aragal. I'm almost curious if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, kind of your thoughts about our thought processes and how the group can maintain itself, and indeed if you had any thoughts to us kind of unswervingly, or me driving us to the home with the creepy children.
Well, starting back at the beginning, Aragal, who was introduced in Session 0 as kind of a flamboyant, kind of maybe a little bit foppish, energetic figure who very was clearly doing a lot to in trying to endear himself to the characters, almost overbearing a little bit, if you will. I didn't necessarily think that the party would greet him with immediate suspicion, but when the mist started coming in and the werewolf attack happened and he just disappeared, nobody seemed to notice and was like, "Oh, okay." I think I asked, I don't remember who I asked, but I asked one of the players to roll a perception check. And they rolled well. It was like, "You notice Aragal is gone." And it was like, new party, new group. I have experience personally with all the members of the group, but not everyone in the group has experience with each other. So, there's a little bit of chemistry growing. So it was like, yeah, it was fine. But I did wish that I guess I wish that someone maybe questioned him a little bit more. I don't know, maybe wish is too strong of a word, but I thought it would be interesting to get kind of the role play chops going, if you will.
And I do think just kind of as an aside, just from like an insight perspective, it is kind of interesting, how you can go back and forth in that mindset, especially for people that are kind of either do D&D enough or new at the same or just as new. You can both sides. You can find yourself having that brief moment of like, all right, I kind of know this story. I've read this type of story before. I've played a video game for like, all right, this is just happening. I've just accepted it, and you just kind of go along with it. Can sometimes pause you from the critical role playing of like, oh, perhaps this should be surprising. How much do I get into my character versus interpreting kind of character tropes?
That's a fair point. I also think Session Zero is an introduction. We spend a little bit of time, going over rules and house rules beforehand, but then in Session Zero itself, it is a little railroady. I want to get the players right into the plot as quickly as possible. I think the actual play time for Session Zero was about 2 hours. So I think there is also a reasonable expectation of, okay, we're gonna follow a little dangling carrot for a while until the plot happens, and it's as I said, it's a little railroady until the game. You enter the game proper. Session one, things open up a little. I know you mentioned wanting me to speak upon the children and the house. Um, I thought I believe there were a couple insight checks upon the children. I think some people were suspicious. A couple of our players were a bit reticent. Our rogue Mortis certainly treated them with suspicion, and our gnome artificer Ravi, they. I'm not sure if they were so much suspicious as they just no, I don't want to help you, children, because Ravi's a bit of a self-centered, what, but that's fine. I think it's a good character.
Fair enough.
But eventually we got everyone into the house, and, they got trapped, as we mentioned before, and they had to find their way out. If I may pick up a little bit back with the kind of synopsizing of where we are to this point. Through session one or two, they made their way through the house, through the main floor of the house, and they found out the basement, where the supposed monster is not so easily accessible. They had to kind of wind their way upstairs, and they encountered the spirits of the ghost children, which were clearly not the same spirits, even though they looked the same. They were not the same spirits they met outside, and they found a secret access to the basement in the attic, which I think is an interesting choice, putting putting access to the basement in the attic. But hey, I did not design this house. The architect must have had some interesting ideas.
There's just I'm almost certain somewhere there's just kind of some philosophy premise or just deeper like metaphor to interpret there of before you can go up you have to go down.
Or the opposite in this case. Before you go down, you gotta go all the way up.
Right, right.
So the party did eventually find the entrance to the basement, and they wandered their way down. And again, they found that the basement, kind of the main dungeon basement area, uh, was the former home of these cultists. There were a lot of beds, straw beds thrown around, and bones and strange talismans. And they got attacked by some rather nasty creatures, boneless, which if any of the listeners own Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, are a monster from that source book, as rather really creepy creatures. They're kind of like they're the opposite of skeletons. They are the animated undead of just flesh and muscle, and no bones at all. That's why they're called boneless. And it got a little ugly there. Even I began sweating a little bit. I was like, "Oh God, are we going to have a TPK, a total party kill against the boneless?" But you guys managed to pull through.
Yeah, I think that was the first time of like actual intense struggle in the campaign. I think it actually was so close that we found ourselves kind of wondering about some of the plot points that you and I had set up, or kind of the one plot point you and I set up, and wondering how viable it would be because of how close that came. But I think we'll get to that one in a moment there. And you said you that was not originally how that encounter was supposed to be? What were you kind of
Right.
thinking when you modified that?
So in the module, that fight is ghouls. Standard, the CR1 undead creatures from the monster manual, which pretty standard. Standard fare makes sense for the kind of environment. But I wanted to spice it up a little. I didn't think that the boneless were appreciably more difficult. I actually think they're slightly less challenging than ghouls. I think ghouls with their paralyzing ability kind of outperform their challenge rating. But I thought the boneless were about equal measure. And hey, I was flipping through Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, said, "Hey, this would be a cool monster. I think it fits the kind of the horrific atmosphere of the dungeon." So that's one of my kind of my first. Uh, I don't want to call it a major tweak. It's certainly not a major tweak. But it's ideas of how to change this up, how to make this encounter a little bit more spicy. A lot of the players probably hadn't encountered boneless in a campaign before. Perhaps some had, but I assume most hadn't. Whereas everyone's fought ghouls before, and I thought boneless would make it a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting how would I say it's you managed to give a more horror gothic themed version of like a jelly. Just while we didn't get quite paralyzed from like a ghoul touch, I would argue it was more terrifying to imagine my sorcerer kind of actually just being consumed and absorbed by a jelly, uh, unable to breathe or do anything. Just suddenly my sorcerer is kind of useless.
Yeah,
So
because
that was a lot.
when they envelop you, you start suffocating, and well, suffocation rules in D&D are a little bit wonky. You can hold your breath for a long time in D&D, depending on your Constitution score, as it's just a visual to kind of get yourself in the head of your character. It's terrifying, just being engulfed by this massive of muscle and skin. It's kind of absorbing you like an ooze would. So after that, the party continued to make their way through the dungeon. They made their way to the sub basement, where they found a kind of reliquary where this cult had held all their talismans and little evil knickknacks, if you will. And they found the reliquary was contained a source of pretty horrifying chanting. I believe the chanters were, or the voices rather, in the reliquary were chanting uh, blood, 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 and darkness, which is a little bit of if any of you played Curse of Strahd, is a little bit of a twist on what is actually in the module, what is actually said, because I'm using the Death House a little bit to set up a kind of later plot point, which is a bit in the module itself. Death House is kind of its own thing. There's a loose tie-in to the main plot, but for the most part, it's a tutorial dungeon, if you will. It's a very hard tutorial dungeon, but here. Let's throw the third level 1 characters in, get them to level 3, and I said, you know what? Death House can do a little bit more than that. We can get a little bit more out of this, and so the chanting's changed because the cultists were doing a little something different in my version of the Death House as opposed to the as written module version of the Death House. So the group continued past the reliquary room, and they saw some kind of altar or chamber in the room beyond. There was a large metal portcullis blocking the way. They couldn't figure out what to do. They couldn't get past it. There didn't seem to be a way to open or close it, so they continued upstairs. They kind of finished exploring the main basement, got into a little bit of a tussle with some shadows. Our cleric, Bobby, did a very good job at pacifying that threat before it started. Shadows can be very dangerous with their strength drain ability, but a quick turn undead, which hit, I think, all but one of them, kind of pacified that fight, and then a mysterious voice then reached out to them to saying that the way is now open, and if they want to leave the house, they have to complete the ritual. And that is where session 2 ended, and session 3, our most recent session, that's where it picked up. And it's funny, Bobby in session 3, the player who plays Bobby, our cleric, was absent. A little bit of short notice, so we had a guest player come in and play Bobby. I kind of quickly threw something together that he was possessed by some old spirit in the house, but there wasn't really much plot stuff going on there. Just to give something. Oh, okay, new player. Don't have to expect you to role play the way Bobby's role playing. So we just kind of hand waved it a little bit, and that's kind of where session 3 started. And I know you at the beginning of session 3, your character Josh started wanted to explore. There was one last little area of the main floor that you wanted to explore, so you kind of headed on in there.
Yeah, and if anything, maybe we pause for a second because I think it just brings up that weird combination of both planning and role playing you kind of have to deal with just the reality of um, a D&D campaign is just like, oh yes, underneath this story is that people have their own lives going on, right? And you just can't always anticipate. I think, both, when I was DMing before and now as you'd seen it, it's just that idea like, you want as much notice as you can for someone to not be there, whether or not someone's going to be there. Um, and so you try to work that into the story if you can, but like, if it comes a little bit late or it's like you're the story's in a weird spot that you don't have a whole lot of flexibility of like you're in a house, how many things can you do with someone's character? Do you just skip over it? Do you just not talk about it and just like, all right, new person, and we just all accept it? And I think it's really hard to find that balance. And I think it was kind of interesting how that played out is that you tried to hit that little bit of a compromise of like, all right, we're going to try to acknowledge it by having this guest player. We're going to have a different kind of entity taking over the original character, so that way we explain it a little bit. But if anything, in the player dynamic, always just we've constantly dealt with this one extreme to another, from having a kind of interview like interrogation before in previous DM sessions for like trying to push so hard on the new player to justify in universe why they're here and why things are happening, to just in this case the utter acceptance, almost apathy to like, all right, guest player, we're not going to say anything. Truly, no one seemed to reference Bobby, that I just felt the need to force myself to be like, hey, it looks like our cleric collapsed and has come up and now talking differently. Um, so I don't know if you had any thoughts on that before we shift over to the ghast fight.
It's a it's kind of that weird kind of balance between not slowing down the game to spend an inordinate amount of time introducing a guest player who is playing one of the player characters filling in, and as well as also like trying to keep it in line with the story. um, I think everyone maybe caught on a little too hard that we were hand waving this. It would have been kind of like interesting if people engaged with it a little more, but I also didn't want to spend like half an hour, 45 minutes going, someone has possessed Bobby. This is clearly a malicious entity. We need to spend the first half an hour, 45-minute session justifying that we are okay with this. So, it's that kind of fine line. I think the group kind of mostly rode the hand wave line, if you will, and, was mostly fine with it. That is, again, preferable than the extraneous amount of time interrogating this new spirit possessing another character, if you will.
I would say, at the very least, assuming it's not part of an actual play podcast or production, I do think if you have to choose between one or the other, accepting things more than necessary, um, as we had seen both with Aragal and, with Bobby in this case, is the preferred way to go, just because there is a time constraint and everyone's got a life going on. Just let it happen. Don't make the DM's life happen. Let's just keep playing the game.
Right, right. So as we continue on, you kind of explored that last room. You found a treasure chest, or more of a footlocker, but it had treasure in it. And when you opened it, you got jumped by a ghast, which was hiding in the wall. And it kind of approached you, and it said a few words. It didn't attack immediately, but your character, Aegis, the sorcerer, immediately attacked it. So there wasn't a lot of RP there, and well, that was fine. It makes sense that it's a ghast. You gotta kill it. I was a little disappointed because there was a slight reveal there. The ghast was Mrs. Harker, the former woman of the house, and I was hoping a little bit that maybe you guys would just add a little bit of kind of context to some of this stuff, but nope. Ghast died. It was meant to be like a little bit of a mini boss fight, sort of, but you guys kind of action economied it to death.
Yeah, I mean, and it was also a combination of the fact we also had some very good rolls, and it was rolling
Yeah,
rather poorly in
it
the
was.
scheme of things.
Yeah,
It was interesting, I guess. Part of it's almost my own transition from not being. I'm not used to being a player just because I was just DMing for effectively 2 years, and now being that there was just that occasional bit of like fear there. I'm playing a draconic sorcerer who just is often taking the lead because of his personality. He's a little bit tanky. He's got a little bit armor class, because of his draconic scales, but still very squishy, still a caster, and just that level of kind of like that fear of indeed just kind of coming out as finding this kind of very intimidating creature. And I'm like, nothing else has been super nice to us in this house. It does feel like everything's threatening, and just kind of figured I didn't want to be in the situation where that thing got a chance to go get the first shot. And so I just kind of choked for the first time in role playing, just like, what? All right, you know what? Forget it. I'm just casting a spell and attacking.
hey, I can't blame you for not being realistic. That's probably if I was in your shoes inside a terrible dungeon and a monster burst out of the wall and I had the power to shoot fire out of my hands, I would probably do that.
And
in
true, perhaps it is the more real role play than
that
anything,
is that
right?
is that's probably true. In the text in the original module, that is meant actually to be two ghasts. It's supposed to be both Mr. and Mrs. Harker, but
Okay.
in my tweaked version of Death House, uh, Mr. Harker was found upstairs dead. He hung himself from his bed a long time ago, and therefore there was no ghast of him down there to be found. So that's probably why the fight was a little bit easier. Two ghasts probably would have been a little bit more of a handful.
Yeah, I was kind of expecting actually that to happen. I'm like, it feels like there's kind of something missing we've seen. But yeah, I was like, all right, we met the two kid ghosts, we met a ghast, and hang on, is there, we haven't accounted for the whole family yet. What's going on? But yeah, I guess yeah, seeing the dead father up there kind of explains it. So good clarity for me right now.
Yeah, I think that's the benefit of talking about some of this stuff in hindsight, able to pull back the curtain a little bit, stuff I can't reveal in session. So you finish the gas fight. You got a nice little treasure load. Got a spell book for our wizard. Got a cloak of protection that our bard, I believe, has taken. And then y'all headed back downstairs to the sub basement and found the portcullis open. Our gnome artificer Ravi decided, oh, in case it's a trap, let's bring one of the rickety chairs down to make sure the portcullis can't close on us. I thought that was slightly amusing. Spoiler alert: when you got into the room, it closed, and the rickety chair was not able to stop a wrought iron portcullis. And then when you got in the room, again, spurred on by this voice that you found in the basement that said that the ritual must be completed, kind of these cloaked, ghostly figures appeared around this kind of ritual chamber, which had covered in water in the floor and had a kind of a big altar in the middle. Oh, and I should also mention, I almost forgot to mention this. There was this large block, kind of 8 foot, 9 foot tall block of amber that was found in the middle of the chamber in the water, not on the ritual dais itself, but off in the water, and had this massive crack down the middle, almost like something was once inside of it and burst free. But so you got into the chamber, and the ghostly figures peered around the chamber and started chanting, one must die," in rapid succession. And there's a bit of a scramble. People are like, well, what does this mean? What are we going to do? And then I guess I'll let you take this from here. You made a decision.
Yeah, right. So this was what the first time that I had done this in a D&D, at least with my own character, was yeah, Aegis just my player character just kills himself by stabbing himself in the chest with an ice knife. Just spell shatters his chest cavity, and he just collapses dead as a sacrifice. Um, I guess we can pull back the curtain on our own a little bit here, in that this is a kind of decision that predates even starting or playing Curse of Strahd. in that we knew you mentioned early on that you were interested in taking over when I finished my campaign, and we were talking to my old dungeon master from when I first started, who had been doing Curse of Strahd with everyone, and did mention this particular encounter being either a player kills themselves or comes up with some kind of sacrifice. Um, and or rather then he's that or an extremely challenging boss, which he describes as a TPK. And I know, I'm sure you could probably clarify what you did differently and what that encounter was like. But it is worth mentioning, we ultimately kind of came to an agreement that rather than making some artificial changes to it, what may have kind of to raise the stakes of the story for all the other players was to indeed ensure that a sacrifice does take place. So this was something we planned for a long time, was that Aegis, my character, was always designed to sacrifice himself. And he was built from the ground up of how do we make someone who would logically do this. And so Aegis was meant to be someone who was his whole backstory was then really designed around someone who had a challenging childhood and kind of got picked up in the right opportunity, discovered his magic at the right moment, and then managed to go from a life that was involving a lot of illicit activities, I guess, and finally found himself on the Strait of Narrow by joining the Order of the Gauntlet, just a super paladin and cleric heavy group really dedicated to good, just kind of playing his own kind of Jesus character that when he really finds out he's in over his head, as kind of this level one guy, um, just finds that if he thinks that he's not going to be able to make it and sees his friends are at risk, sees anyone at risk, he would sooner remove himself from the equation to save everyone else. Um, and I think that had a meaningful impact there, and I think it did. Although it was kind of a shock silence, it was a level of shock for the team.
It's one of those things where, Josh did get spoiled on this plot point, so we kind of discussed, okay, um, you know, we want to do something. We want to kind of create a dramatic story moment, that this kind of ritual chamber, this one must die thing. This is something Josh already knew about. So the battle, yes, if you don't sacrifice himself in the text, you fight a shambling mound, and y'all are level 2, and unless you get some insanely lucky rolls, that shambling mound's going to kill you. I don't know why they chose a shambling mound for that fight. It doesn't really fit very well thematically, and it's an overwhelming challenge. I did do a kind of a homebrew altered version of this fight, an idea that I got that from a number of sources online, actually posited this idea, the idea of a flesh mound. This kind of it fits in better with the atmosphere, and also because it's a homebrewed creature, it's kind of this just almost kind of like a massive kind of boneless creature, if you will. Uh, it's a homebrewed creature, so it's a little bit dialed back in scale. But even so, it would be a very, very hard fight. And one thing that we're concerned about and we really want is to have great role playing, great story moments, and sometimes you don't want to rob the other players of agency, but still, when a player wants to have this kind of big, impactful, story moment, uh, you want to let them have it. And Josh knew that this was going to happen, so we kind of put together this idea. And he just sacrificed himself, and the ritual was completed. They did not have to fight the flesh mound, and instead, Aegis's blood got sacrificed to this malevolent entity. I guess I'll kind of follow up on what happened after that. His blood got kind of pulled up. All the light sources that the party brought into the room kind of all got snuffed out, and this terrifying visage appeared and told them, "Welcome to my domain." And they got all spat out of the death house and kind of landed on a heap outside of it. And then poof, the death house wasn't there anymore. All that was left of the building that they were once in was this large stone, or this large block of amber that had that big crack in it, and there was nothing else there. And that was our conclusion to the Death House, the tutorial dungeon, if you will, What were like your thoughts overall on it as a kind of an intro dungeon?
And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I would also say, to the idea, this intro dungeon, even kind of knowing what was going to happen, I don't think changed the impact of it. I think going through all the middle points was still very kind of impactful. Dealing with Boneless, I don't think either of us were quite prepared or really thinking about like, what if Aegis dies before he can sacrifice himself? What do we do then? And I would say, even um, reaching the sacrifice moment, it is still a big thing. Almost like, kind of giving up your pet or something really precious. I think when it finally came down to it, hearing one must die, it was still really heavy to actually kind of bite the bullet and say like, all right, my character is just gonna off himself. He's just gone. He's dead. When all is said, I enjoyed playing that character. I enjoyed role playing him. In this way, I try to treat it as a bit of method acting. I think it's more fun that way, and it is letting go of something that you're attached to. So I hope that if I, even knowing what was happening, everyone else not being able to anticipate what's happening, I hope it was as good for them.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned a few times, as we were discussing after sessions, like, oh, like I'm having fun playing Aegis, even knowing that the plan was for him to be sacrificed. You're like, oh, I'm having fun. Am I sure that I want to kill this character that I'm enjoying playing? You get attached to them even though you already know what their fate is. So yeah, no more Aegis. Death House spat them out, and the party kind of need to take a little time to collect themselves. Ravi, who had a backstory connected to Aegis, uh, kind of moved right on to the anger stage of mourning. There was a lot of like, "Oh, how could you do this? You're so selfish," etc. And I thought that was I think that was a good, interesting response that was in line with Ravi's character. Um, and then the party took a short rest. Then and Mortis, the rogue, did something a little bit interesting. He mentioned that he was having visions ever since he entered this strange mist-laden place, and that the visions told him that he needed to touch or make contact with something, an amber sarcophagus, he said, and he surmised eventually, took him a little bit of time, that this large stone block of amber was probably what he meant, or what the vision meant rather. And he went up and he touched it, and he some of this strange sensation pushed out of his hand into the block of amber. And none of the group really reacted to it. I know, Josh, you probably would have reacted to it. It's a little bit weird, but you didn't have a character there at the time, so unfortunately you couldn't. So I was a little disappointed. Is not the word. But it was like, oh, someone's having a character moment, and no one's reacting to it, especially since a rogue is a new player and he's still getting new and comfortable with role playing. And I thought, oh, great, he's spending some time to get more into the character, and this is great. And then people didn't react very well, or react very much. I guess say there wasn't a negative reaction, there was more of a non-reaction.
And perhaps just to back up a moment here, Mortis didn't come up with his own visions.
No,
You were
yes,
you were feeding these to him, right? How do you want to mention a little bit how you were doing that,
right.
giving him
So
the setup?
yes, this was a kind of a planned character, backstory is not the word, but some planned a character arc that he and I have been building, and that I've trying to been put together to help him get more into the role playing, get more into the story, because he's new and he's not as experienced as role playing. And I think having a more personalized stake in the story is a great way to get a new player into the game more. So I was feeding him these visions through DMs, and then also I did kind of a brief private voice chat with him. I should probably clarify, we are playing these games um, online. We're playing them on Roll20 and using Discord. We are unfortunately not in person because we are kind of all over the place. Not everyone has access to transportation and the fact that COVID's still a thing. Travel is difficult, so we have been playing online. I should probably mention that. But yeah, I kind of did kind of a brief thing with him. His first vision, if you will. I kind of did a brief one-on-one RP. So this wasn't something that he just kind of came up with on his own. He had a little thing going on, and he kind of manifested it. And I was hoping that some of the group would be like, "Oh, what are you talking about?" But no one really reacted. But that's fine. The group still hasn't been together that long. The chemistry is still building, and I don't want to sound like I'm complaining. Oh, my players aren't doing a good job. No, everyone's done a great job, I think, so far. But I was hoping a little bit more for his sake, that we get a little bit more out of that.
I think if anything, your DM credentials as a dungeon master, not the direct messages you're giving to Don, are questionable. You are being far too positive to be a legitimate dungeon master. Not nearly enough complaining.
Well, thank you. So after that, the group took a short rest, and then they got a visit from uh, a black plate mailed figure on a flaming destrier, a this kind of this horse with smoke coming out of its nostrils and a flaming mane just kind of appeared out of the ether, and this figure in black plate mail appeared. But this figure had no head. It was a headless horseman, if you will. The party, fresh from the death house, was a bit anxious. Oh God, what now? But the headless horseman didn't send threats or warnings or any sort of violence. He left a gift basket containing some potions, a magic item, an amulet of proof against detection and location, and also some wine and bread and cheese, and also a note welcoming the party to Barovia and telling them they have now joined or become part of the Great Game, a most ancient and sacred tradition within Barovia. And about as soon as he came, the Headless Horseman left and disappeared into the ether once again atop his horse. And I do kind of wish that you were present for that in the voice chat. Obviously, you didn't just vanish when your character died, but I think it would have been nice to have everyone there for when the plot is happening now.
Yeah, no, all I can say is that there was a punishment dealt, unintentional or otherwise, for having your character kill himself and wanting to try to keep the story going logically. If anything, it helped give me time to just give little interjections to help keep up the facade of the seemingly spontaneous nature of my and my character's decision, at least.
Right. I do think it's yes. We probably should probably mention that this was kind of kept under wraps in the party, and when it was done, we didn't let anyone know that this was pre-planned. If any of them listen to this, which some of them may, even though we've told them not to, well, cat's out of the bag. It was planned. But at the time, the facade was still keeping up. So it was like, oh, Josh was like, oh, well, God, I got to scramble, find a new character. I have always encouraged everyone to have backup characters ready. This is a dangerous campaign, so it's not really surprising that you would have backup character ready. But we did kind of have something ready to go. Um, and so the party kind of continued on the road, seeing a village in the distance, and that's when they ran into your new character. And you want to talk a little about your new character's introduction and how you're ready to move on from Aegis.
Yeah, so obviously when your character is your first character is designed to expire relatively early on, you need to have a backup unless your intention is to stop playing after that. Um, it was if anything, this is almost a precursor to the precursor without getting too heavy or self-aggrandizing about it. I mean, we talked before about the idea of kind of different ways of co-DMing. And we'll put in the show notes at some point because it is simply beyond me which podcast I first heard of really the co-DMing concept. Um, but we had the idea of kind of having a player character who could help not quite co-DM in the same way of a literal you do one part of the story and I do the other as both official dungeon masters, but that kind of person who helps keep the story going and can act as kind of an asset to the players. Wizards of the Coast has a variety of source books, not just the campaign modules, but has the books just describing the universes or multiverse campaign settings that they have for their various campaigns. So we've seen this in Forgotten Realms, and indeed, in case it hasn't been said to you, you haven't known yet. The Curse of Strahd campaign is um, based in the Ravenloft setting. And so, what if we managed to have a character who had the knowledge of the Ravenloft setting, which is described in the source book of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft? So we had that character, had a character who could have the knowledge of that, and so we had Alis, the monk, who was, in this case, treated as a character who would have had the literal guide of Van Richten, the kind of monster hunter extraordinaire that has been across the Ravenloft setting. So someone who could kind of give a little bit better exposition to the world, and then kind of weave him into the story. So I loved making him as just someone who could do something a little bit different. I don't know if you actually want to speak at all a little bit as to kind of what you ultimately kind of decided on would be the narrative to Alis before he was introduced.
Right. So Alis was first conceived as you and I did a kind of a one shot. It's kind of a practice round, if you will, before I fully got into back into DMing, and you had this character Talith, and the one shot was based on coming and having dinner with Strahd von Zarovich in his castle of Ravenloft, and then we kind of that was just a one shot. It only went for a few hours, not even a few hours, less than that, like a couple, and then we kind of say, okay, well, what is Alis going to do from here? Alis did survive. Sorry, Talith. I apologize, Talith. Talith is the character from the one shot. You decided, well, what is Talith going to do from here? He survived the one shot, despite my best efforts to have that not happen. And we decided that, oh, well, Talith is going to become a servant of Strahd von Zarovich. And that is where kind of the idea of Aleph came from. Alis, I apologize. I keep messing up the names. You pick too many characters that have A-E in the beginning of their name. Aegis and now Alis. The idea Alis is the son of Talith, and he has been living in the domains of dread, specifically the Carnival domain of dread. If anyone has the Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft source book, you should be familiar with the different domains of dread and the Carnival. And he is here on a mission to find his father, who has been a servant to Strahd for a very long time. That's kind of the little bit of the narrative background of Alis. But the idea also was to have one of these characters that knows a little bit more about the setting. They're not a complete fish out of water. Alis did not grow up in Barovia, but he grew up in the domains of dread. He understands how they've worked. The carnival kind of wanders between the different domains, so he's been to many of them. So he does have a little bit of knowledge about the Ravenloft setting as a whole, not necessarily the setting of Barovia, because I don't want a big part of the Curse of Strahd is the mystery element and not knowing everything that's going on. I didn't want Alis to be able to just say, that's where that happened. I know because I was there 20 years ago. But just have a little bit more knowledge to kind of lead the characters, the rest of the party, in a kind of a less aimless direction.
Yeah, and I think we had a kind of fun component. It shows that like that other part of it is how can you kind of modify the story by both creating a character that can contextualize the world just from their knowledge, but also then having someone by having a player character that's woven enough into the story that it feels a little bit organic to have one of the characters, who plays face or kind of leads or it gives a natural reason to continue down a plot point or move in a direction. Because I think, even you've experienced that when I was DMing, sometimes you can kind of feel if there's that heavy-handed nature of the DM is placing this kind of big arrow that says, go this way. Go this way. And there can be an either combative point where you either want to almost reject the DM sometimes, versus like, well, I guess we kind of have to do this, and then the actual sensation, the player, the feeling of autonomy is gone. And even if it's not always there, every campaign, like you leave the campaign, of course, the game's over. You still always want to have that sensation that there is always that suspension of disbelief. That not quite illusion of choice, but that sense that you're still in the world and still doing something logically with a story rather than something kind of arbitrary or forced.
Right, yeah, and Alis was kind of able to, or he's only been around for like a quarter of a session so far, so I shouldn't say what he has done. What he hopefully will be able to do is, again, not so much shepherd the rest of the group in a particular direction. There's going to be a lot of directions that Alis does not know how to shepherd the party in the direction of. Hopefully you haven't gone and read all my notes, hacked into my PC, and know where I'm taking everything. But hopefully be able to, you know, settle the party in and maybe understand a little bit of the context and the relevance of the world. Again, Alis is not from Barovia, but he knows who Strahd von Zarevich is. He understands the significance of the domains of dread, and who knows, he may be familiar with some of the NPCs the party may meet in the future. Gotta stay tuned to find out.
Yeah, and so to that end, I guess it was kind of as a final thought to it. Um, it gave that a slightly more organic feeling to it. And once the characters are dumped out in front of a block of amber and nothing, instead of just kind of following the road aimlessly, we have someone who can then somewhat naturally exposit a little bit about the domains of dread without going too at length, and then give a kind of more positive reason or clear push of like, okay guys, I've been around here, I know where the village is, follow me. That can get them to the next quest point, and without necessarily risking them someone going just like, I'd like to go west, or that sense of any direction is as good as any other. Should we mention the village or just save that for another time?
Yeah, I think we should probably save the village for next episode. We really hope you guys enjoyed listening to this episode 1 of the Mistwalkers podcast. We certainly had a lot of fun making it, and there should be hopefully many episodes in the future, so stay tuned for episode 2. Take care and goodbye.
Step softly.